Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm François Picard. The unwinding of Syria went brutally fast, and yet 7 years on, it's still playing out in slow motion. Brutally fast because it only took a few months to morph from a protest movement into a full-blown civil war. Slow motion when seen through the lens of our guest, our own former Beirut correspondent, Rania Abouzeid, whose book, No Turning Back, chronicles snapshots over those 7 years of coverage, the metamorphosis of the people she visits and then revisits. Rania, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming into our studios.
Thank you.
The unwinding of Syria in March of 2011, when there's those initial protests at the time of the Arab Spring, was the future unwritten, or was it certain that this would end violently and would become violent very fast?
No, at the time, the people who I walked with in protests thought that every week, every Friday was going to be Assad's last week, given the events in the region. It only took 18 days for Mubarak to step down. The Tunisian leader had fled. Gaddafi was teetering. There were protests in Bahrain and Yemen. It was a very, very different time.
A very different time, but very quickly it becomes violent.
Yes, and the thing about the Syrian uprising is that it didn't proceed along one track. There were many different tracks, and that's what I try and show in the book, that while some people were still protesting, in other parts, men had picked up guns, because it was also very spontaneous. It was a leaderless revolution in the sense that every village, every geographical region did things differently.
So you profiled different people who you met through those 7 years, and you visit them and revisit them. How did you come up with the idea for this book in that respect?
I never intended to write a Syria book. I was just simply reporting it. And I was reporting it for various magazines. And it wasn't until about 2014, 2015 that I thought that maybe I should put this into book form. And I did so for one reason only, and that's because the United Nations stopped counting Syria's dead. So Syrians all of a sudden weren't even numbers. And that fact angered me. So I wanted to put people back into the heart of the story.
One of those people reduced to a number is this young activist who, back in those days of March, those heady days of March 2011, is sitting in a restaurant and peers up at the TV and says, "Hey, what's this?" And he was reduced to a number. His name is Suleiman, and he then wound up spending years in prison.
Yeah, and this was the trajectory that many of Assad's opponents faced. They I remember being in protests, and there was one young man who told me that there's no turning back. Either we continue along this path, or we will be hunted. So there was the sense that this was a battle that was existential from the start for all sides. One side had to prevail over the other. There was not going to be any middle ground.
Why? Why is that? Why in Syria could there be no middle ground?
Because the fate of the regime was at stake. And that was the sense.
Was the fate of the regime at stake? Because we've had activists on our shows saying, no, all we wanted was reform.
They did want reform. In the beginning, the calls weren't for the downfall of the regime. So the battle cry of the Arab uprisings, the people want the fall of the regime, didn't come to Syria until much later after the protests started. Initially, they wanted reform, and they looked to the man who helmed the regime, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, as the man to deliver that reform. And they, so many people truly believed that he would offer concessions. But they soon learned that even the concessions that he offered weren't enough, and that wasn't going to be the case.
And while Suleiman languishes in prison, more hardened opponents of Assad, Islamists, get released.
Yes, and I went back and investigated the arming and the Islamization of the uprising, and I've presented much new information in this book. I talked to many of the inmates who were in Sednaya prison, which was the main one, as well as Palestine branch in Damascus. And they all talk about those early months in the uprising when they knew that they were going to be released, and how they started to mobilize and plan because they saw a darker opportunity in the unrest that people like Suleiman, he was peacefully protesting while these Islamists were planning, and they had much darker motivations.
So they had much darker motivations, yet they knew they were going to be released?
Yes, they knew.
Why?
Word came through in the prisons, and I document that in the book, where they start saying that they learned of these prison amnesties, and so they knew that they were going to be released, and they received orders saying, just wait, and wait until the new leader arrives.
So it
and
wasn't
in
just
August 2011, he crossed the border from Iraq into Syria.
So this isn't just a conspiracy theory that Assad released the jihadists so that there could be chaos and he could say, look, it's either me or them.
Some people say that he released them because that was one of the calls of the opposition, to release political prisoners. But there were many other political prisoners who remained in jail, and some of them are still in jail. There's a young woman called Tala al-Mallouhi, who was just a teenager, who wrote a blog post, and her whereabouts are still unknown. So there were many activists who remained in jail while these Islamists were let out.
Islamists are let out, and you had unfettered access to some of them. One who's even at one point was a top advisor to the leader of the al-Nusra Front, the officially sanctioned al-Qaeda militia inside of Syria. And it's fascinating to see what the mindset is. Ideology drives all of your characters.
To a degree, yeah. Ideology drives some of them, and just the will to live drives others, like Roja, for example, who was one of the characters, and she's a 9-year-old girl in 2011. And I show the uprising and the war through a child's eyes and through the lens of a regular family, so that you can see what the last 7 years were like for a young girl like Roja. Was
it dangerous frequenting a top al-Nusra leader?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I had to be very careful. It was very difficult to get to him. It was very difficult for him to get him to trust me. But I had spent a lot of time with this militia. I was the first journalist to interview a fighter, and then later an official. And I came to have very vast contacts within the group, leading to all the way up to their Shura Council, which is their governing council. So I had the contacts.
And all the Islamists that you speak to express their disgust over the fact that some people turn to profiteering and trafficking and kidnapping for ransom, and they don't like the infighting between the various movements. How many of them have kept, well, literally their faith?
Even though they themselves were engaged in many of those same things. The journalists who were kidnapped, for example, were kidnapped by Islamists, by al-Nusra, and then later Islamic State. So they themselves were engaged in many of the same things that they derided others for having participated in.
So why do they speak to you? Why would they speak to you?
That's a question I ask myself all the time. Why does anybody speak to us, especially in a situation when it's a conflict? It's dangerous, and I mean, if you think about what we do, really, we stick a microphone or a camera or a pen and pad in front of somebody, often when they're having the worst day of their life, and it's really surprising to me that people still speak to us. People have different motivations for speaking to us. Some of the characters in my book just wanted to be acknowledged, and wanted their stories to be acknowledged, and wanted to be identified as people, not numbers.
Because in the past it was easier, right? You needed those Western journalists to get your message out. Now, ISIS has its own magazines and channels. They don't need Western journalists.
Very true. That is very true. It's not like the days of old when you needed to be on CNN to get your message across. Now, it has almost democratized the distribution of information, because
yet they still speak to you.
Yeah, because anybody with a smartphone can disseminate information. But yes, I was fortunate in that they did still speak with me.
You speak about that little girl, Roja. She is at the opposite scale of the spectrum, you might say. And she, at one point, finds herself a refugee in Turkey. Today, she's back in Syria?
Yes. I have never met a Syrian who doesn't want to go home.
And you're still in contact with her. What do you say to her?
I check on her, see how she's doing, ask her about her grades, about her life, about her family, about her new friends. And I just have a conversation that I would have with any young teenage girl. She's now a teenager.
She's now a teenager. Is she still the same little girl inside?
I think that every person in the book has changed. Changed in fundamental ways. And 7 years of a brutal conflict can't but help change a person. I mean, some of the people who start out hopeful and are disenfranchised, some who were hopeful have retained their hope, some have abandoned their ideals, others still cling to them. So it's they really are epic journeys, and sadly they're not unusual. There are millions of Syrians who have undergone similar changes, and that was one of my big challenges when I sat down to write the book, was like, there are just so many incredible stories. Which ones do I choose?
Yeah, and I know that you wrote the book, but not the title. The subtitle of the book is Life, Loss, and Hope in Wartime Syria. Where's the hope?
Actually, I wrote the title too.
You wrote the title as well?
Yes, I had the title from the beginning, No Turning Back, because I felt that was, everybody kept telling me no turning back. The hope is in the people. The hope is in, it's the small things. It's the building blocks of a community. It's the men who want to go back home and do something positive for the community. It's the doctors who still stay in their communities, who want to help their own people even though they can flee. It's these little things that may seem inconsequential, but that's how communities come back together.
Rania Abouzeid, many thanks. The title of the book again is No Turning Back. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 interview.